So welcome everybody to the session on how to profit from tariffs. And what we're going to talk about today is how a lot of the daily news that we're hearing out there can actually create winners and losers in the economy. And a lot of people, they get so caught up in the politics and the hype, they think, okay, well, this is just politics and people are trying to win, score points, do this and that in the electoral system. What we're going to talk about today, though, is how, as in all politics, what's really happening is that there is the creation of winners and losers. And winners and losers is really what defines a modern capitalist economy. So every time we hear about a new tariff being introduced where some country is going to have some percent increase, then the next day it goes back to being, okay, we're going to pause that, then we're going to go after another country. This is kind of like what I call pinball politics, right? Where every day the ball's moving in a different direction. And it makes it very difficult for not only distributors, but also manufacturers to be successful. And so what we want to talk about today is really how can any company in a given industry be successful in a tariff environment. And I should say to get started that I think tariffs are not going to be like a one and done. Like sometimes you think, am I in a situation where I just need to wait it out, where I can just sit on my hands and this will go away, kind of like a bad dream? But it doesn't really work that way. And we can tell from this administration that they are committed to tariffs as an important part of how they conduct domestic policy and also foreign policy. And so that means that for everybody in the room who's relying on foreign suppliers or whose suppliers are sourcing abroad, tariffs are going to be an important part of your life for the next couple of years. So by a show of hands, how many of you have, let's say, over 25% of your sales dependent on foreign sourcing today? How many have over 50%? 75? Okay, so we can see this is a really important topic. And as we've heard from the president, the magnitude of tariffs right now, they range from 10%, which is kind of like the baby walk tariff, all the way through hundreds of percent. And we all know that, on a daily basis, distribution is a very thin margin business. And historically, we fight to get 5%. And when you start hearing about the magnitude of these cost increases, you're seeing numbers that really don't even relate to anything that we have on a daily basis. So how many of you today have more than 1,000 SKUs or part numbers that you sell? And how many have over 1,000 customers? Okay, so the math here of this tariff problem comes down to literally millions of combinations. So if you have 1,000 products and 1,000 customers, and you have negotiated pricing, that means you have 1 million possible pricing permutations. And so the interesting question with tariffs is, how do you know what the right amount to pass through is in over 1 million possible combinations? It's not really just about a single number because, as you know, there's sourcing that goes on all over the world. All of these countries have their own tariff regimes that are being assigned to them. Some countries are going to get 10%, some are going to get 20%, some will get 150%. We've heard about the Chinese tariffs that are being thrown around. What that means is if you've got 1 million plus combinations, and by the way, many distributors, if I describe our typical Epicor strategic pricing clients, they typically will have at least 3,000 customers and probably at least 25,000 part numbers or SKUs. That's 75 million permutations. And so the most difficult problem that every distributor has to solve is, what is the pass-through rate? That's the number that we're going to talk about today. What's the pass-through rate of tariffs in millions of possible combinations? Now, fortunately for all of you, are all of you on either P21 or Eclipse? Anybody not on one of those two platforms? So some people may be looking at software. So, the big challenge is, how do you manage that SKU level, potentially SKU level pass-through question? Some SKUs are going to get a lot of tariff. Some SKUs in the same product family are not going to get a lot of tariff. How do you manage that across all the different customers that you sell to? And fortunately, this is really just a strategic pricing question that's being reframed in the context of an urgent situation. So there's already the question of, how do you successfully price millions of combinations and make sure your salespeople aren't giving it away? But now with tariffs, it's become an urgent question. Today, if you're getting, let's say, a 10% inbound cost increase from your suppliers, and your salespeople are using last price paid. How many of you have salespeople use last price paid? Come on, raise your hands, you know this is happening. If you use last price paid, you just lost 10%, right? And this happens day after day after day. By the way, how many of you know what percent of your revenue comes from last price paid? I think that's why we didn't get as many hands. This is a huge issue. We've been studying this with SPARXiQ distributor clients now and really in earnest the last year. We started studying this. We found that most distributors have 30, 40, 50% of their revenue coming from transactions where somebody at the counter found this little key back through their ERP and did last price paid. In a tariff environment, that's going to kill you because last price paid isn't adjusting for all of that. And so it's becoming a really important question now. How do we start to fix this? So first of all, tariffs are going to be here to stay. And then secondly, they're going to require an adjustment. Every company that sits back and just keeps doing things the way they're doing it is at risk of having their shareholders pay the tariff instead of their customers. Now, there's a few ways you can mitigate this. If you set up, for example, a lot of your pricing libraries using margin multipliers or list price multipliers, that can help you to at least have prices adjust as soon as the cost or list price basis changes. How many of you are using those kind of margin or discount multipliers? How many of you have a significant percentage of your revenue, though, that's on net pricing agreements with your customers? Okay, so you can see, though, that the big question here is what gets passed through. As long as you can count on your suppliers to be updating their list prices or their cost bases, at least if you've maintained those multipliers, a certain amount of your pricing is going to pass through. Where it's not going to necessarily pass through is when people do overrides, for example. How many of you have a significant amount of pricing overrides in your business? And this is where I think there's really two devils here that we have to come to terms with. One is last price paid, which is super harmful in a high tariff environment. And then the second is pricing overrides. Because when salespeople engage in pricing overrides, all of a sudden, whatever you've tried to do in the system to mitigate tariffs, they're undoing that. And so they can back off. And they don't know what they're doing when they do this. And that's the scariest part when they start deviating from system pricing. So just a little bit of thinking through how does industry structure start to affect your response to tariffs. So in a lot of cases, if you think about the line card of products that you sell, think about maybe you've got 50 or 100 different suppliers. Each of those suppliers has a different type of industry structure that they're in. Some of them are in very competitive industries. There might be 5 or 10 different companies selling that category of products. Those are what we'd call the most competitive markets that you're selling into. Then there's the opposite of that. Have you noticed in recent years how a lot of manufacturers are buying up smaller competitors and consolidating? These are consolidated industries. And the reason I bring up the industry structure is that depending on the industry structure of your suppliers, you're going to have more or less pass-through of tariffs. What happens when markets are very competitive is companies try to win market share by not passing through tariffs. That is, they actually believe if I hold back and my competitors move forward, then I'm going to potentially gain share from the customer because I'm the one who didn't move. So in very competitive markets, that's where you have to understand in your own line card, what is the structure of competition across the companies whose products you sell? So have any of you done any profiling of this to understand industry structure? It really wasn't important until this started to come up as a topic. But being able to forecast where you're going to have the biggest brunt of tariff increases from your suppliers is super important. That's going to mean you're going to manage your pricing tools very differently. You're going to start to focus your efforts, your research, and your actions where you have the greatest pass-through rates by the supplier, which is largely a function of industry structure. How many of you are getting a significantly faster announcement of price increases from your suppliers in the last 6 months? Yeah, we've heard examples now where we've already had year to date 3 times as many supplier price increases as there were in all of last year. We think the pace of that's going to continue to even accelerate further because what's happened so far is a lot of the tariffs that have been announced have been paused or delayed, or they've been vacillated on. So what's happened we work with both manufacturers and distributors at SPARXiQ. What we know is a lot of the manufacturers are kind of sitting back even though they've had tariffs announced on their products. That's because they've either they forward bought and got inventory so they could isolate themselves for a period of time, or because they just wanted to see what the final number is. I mean, there's a lot of chaos right now, and what manufacturers don't want to do is they don't want to get to the point where they announce a number and then they find out they overshot because the president backs off, or they undershoot and they have to keep announcing over and over again. So there's a lot of tariff velocity, if you will, that still hasn't even played through the system. And that's where this is so important right now, is to start to get your pricing architecture under control. How many of you have salespeople who negotiate pricing with your customers? Like where that's the predominant way that this happens. The biggest problem with salespeople is whatever actions you take in the system, if they keep deviating and going around it, the steps you've taken are going to get unwound. And there's only two people who can pay the tariff, right? There's either the customer or there's the shareholders. How many of you work, by the way, for ESOPs? Employee-owned companies. Okay, some. The sad part in this case is it's basically the employees are having to pay the cost increases for these tariffs. But in any event, the most important thing you have to get your arms around is how do we start to build up our pricing architecture so that it's resilient in the face of all of this? And then how do we start to manage the deviations away from the system with our salespeople? So when you look at the real cost of salespeople haggling and negotiating, it's really typically over 1,000 basis points, 10 margin points difference between what happens when salespeople sell at system pricing and when they sell at override pricing. So as I mentioned, profiling your line cards, starting to understand how does your pricing architecture, whether it's contracts and special price agreements, whether it's matrix pricing, all of those different levels have to be built in a way that inbound cost increases will get updated in your system. But then the next question is, how do we make sure that the salespeople aren't deviating and starting to break all the rules and unwind all of that? So one of the things that we've done with Epicor to try to help mitigate this is starting about a decade ago, even before tariffs were a significant issue, we built tools within the ERP system so that all of a sudden you can actually manage at the SKU level pricing adjustments, and you can manage the ability of salespeople to deviate through overrides. There's special tools built within the Epicor SPARXiQ strategic pricing module that put brakes on that, guardrails, if you will. So right now is a good time for you to think about, is it time for me to clean up my pricing to make sure that our system pricing is no longer, let's say, last price paid, that it's no longer got, these cost plus 10, cost plus 20, these peanut butter margins that are polluting the system. How do we start to really make sure that our pricing architecture is robust and it reflects market pricing? And that's really the challenge that's out there today. So what do we mean when we say strategic pricing? We mean the ability for a distributor to be able to mine transactional data in your business system. What are the most sensitive products that we sell to our customers? What are the least sensitive products that we sell to our customers? Depending on how sensitive products are, that determines how much of a pass-through we can put through of our tariffs. So we get a 10% increase from our supplier. If we're in a very competitive market on an A item, we may or may not be able to pass that all the way through to our customer. It may be smarter for us to balance that. Let's say we have a partial pass-through. Maybe it's 5% on an A item. And then we balance that by having greater increases on C and D items, for example. That's a common competitive tactic. How many of you are doing something like that today where you balance core product pricing against non-core product pricing? Well, what's happening right now is we're at the point where you have to take that idea and scale it. Because right now, if you're passing through 50% increases on a particular product, just to give an example, the market's not going to accept that. Those small numbers that we got before when suppliers did their annual increases, those could work. When you start breaking the scale by implementing 10, 15, 20, 30% price increases, everything falls apart. And what happens in that situation is competitors start to jockey over who's going to have the least price increases. And it's that ability to tailor the price increase on the A items versus the C and D items that's going to determine success. Have you guys heard of peanut butter pricing? What is peanut butter pricing?
It's like applying one rate to a whole group of products.
That's right. So it's basically you take a single margin that you like and you put it on every product that you sell. What's wrong with doing that?
Doesn't take into account product sensitivity.
So if we have, for example, we put 50 on everything, then we end up overshooting on price on the most sensitive items and potentially leaving money on the table with the least sensitive. So what's a better approach than that? How do you profile sensitivity in your business? Any suggestions? Sensitivity is the root of the question here. How do we know what's the most sensitive in the business? Sir?
Well, I'm in IT. We lean on the salespeople.
Okay. So everything's sensitive.
We use velocity pricing.
What's that?
Velocity pricing.
So that's like your inventory turns?
Yeah.
Okay.
Based off of dollars brought in. So we're fluctuating.
Sales volume.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other ideas? How do you get to the bottom of the price sensitivity question?
Analysis to understand where, and we know where we're competitive in the market, we have to remain competitive, and we know where we can stretch because we're the ones you can get it from.
And where do you typically get those market data from?
Our own research within mining.
So you do like scraping?
We have access to a lot of data.
That's great. How about other people?
We'll take price line, one of the sellers, the guarantee, we'll pick different margins for leaders. We'll do a representative item for each one. It will map that out across the price line.
Okay. Other ideas? Yeah.
The sales team will gather anecdotal comments from distributors who kind of help us accurate about what competitors charge on the same projects.
So they'll basically feed you project intel, that sort of thing?
They kind of will, but we're never sure how universally accurate it is, or if that's just like a one-off they're telling you.
It could be just anecdotal. Yeah, that's one of the challenges for everybody, is how do you get to the point where across millions of pricing permutations, you have an answer to the question, what's most sensitive? And that's where transactional data analysis is so important. Being able to get 12 months of invoice history that tells you, for every single customer's market basket, how much did they spend on that product? How frequently do they repeat order that product? What's their average order quantity? When you start to use these multi-factor models that help you understand from the buyer's perspective as opposed to from the seller's perspective, then you can finally start to get to the answer of where can we extract more margin and where should we be passing through more aggressively our pricing. Does that make sense? Yeah. One of the things that we've noticed working with hundreds of distributors over the last 20 years is that the last mile is really the salespeople. And if the salespeople haven't been trained in how to negotiate effectively, a lot of margin points get lost. How many of you have trained your salespeople in a professional negotiation training program? Got one. How did that go for you?
It's probably one of our most successful programs we have, most wanted, talked about.
One of the most wanted and talked about programs. Other people invest in training your salespeople? One of the most interesting statistics that we've learned about is over 90% of buyers in distribution have been trained in professional negotiation. Less than 10% of sellers have been trained in negotiation. Does that sound like a lopsided playing field? Yeah, it is. In fact, it's like taking candy from a baby. It really is. You see salespeople on a daily basis folding under the pressure that buyers put on them. In many cases, the buyers aren't even comparing quotes. They're just simply saying, you got to do better than that. And the salesperson says, well, where do you need me to be? Basically, the customer dictates the price, right? Where do you need me to be? Like, they didn't even have to do any research. All they had to do was learn that one-liner, and the margins come tumbling down. So the reason I bring this all up is that part of the challenge in pricing is analytical, and part of the challenge is behavioral. If you really want to be successful, in pricing in general, and particularly in a tariff environment where you have this kind of existential crisis around pricing, you have to get better behavior from your salespeople. And that means training them in this weak muscle of negotiation. They actually have to learn how to have backbone, how to negotiate as a principled negotiator. When they give a concession, would it hurt to ask for something in return from the customer? That's how you start to break the velocity of concessions in the business. How many of you have a dog at home that begs for food? Raise your hand. Why do dogs beg for food? Because it works, right? You show me a dog that doesn't beg for food, I'll show you a dog where it never worked, right? That's why certain dogs don't beg for food, because it never worked. And with salespeople, if they don't understand how to build customer expectations, they get into this begging relationship with their customers. And you got to break that, because what did we just talk about? We talked about how when the business environment changes and all of a sudden we have radically different velocity and magnitude of cost increases, if we're doing everything by the seat of our pants, there's a lot that can be lost in that whole situation. So as you think about how to become a better pricing organization in the context of the next couple years of tariff, it's good to think about both the analytical aspect and also the behavioral. So SPARXiQ has built with Epicor a module that helps to really put better architecture in place to manage cost increases, and also to put guardrails around the salespeople. For example, you can say, for this particular group of customers, there's no overriding allowed. Or you can say, for this role, maybe it's a particular CSR that you're not going to allow, or it's counter people that you want to block. Being able to put those guardrails on helps to protect you from the adverse impact of tariffs. But don't forget the behavioral side of it. If your salespeople haven't been trained in how to negotiate effectively, the best systems work can be undone by them. Any questions, comments, thoughts?
I think it is important what you talk about, the training of the CSRs. A lot of the salesmen, the smart salesmen you work with, won't cut the prices because they know that's taking away some of their commission dollars. Those are the smart guys.
The smart ones won't, because commissions will be lost.
And the other ones that don't want to fight, they're the ones that will drop the price, go and say, go beat up the vendor now.
Try to get a cost
Try to get it
support.
lower to get the margin back again that way.
Go beat up on the
I think
vendor.
with this tariff thing, one of the things that at least I wanted to learn out of this is to be able to explain this to all the CSRs that do price decreases. Get a message across that historically you may have done that, but you can't do that in this environment right now today. Because you could be putting us in a worse spot than that 5% that you cut off before can really hurt us now.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You know, there's so much communication around tariffs, and this is really kind of like, it reminds me a little bit of COVID, just in the sense that it's like almost like a black swan event, right? It was very difficult to forecast that all of a sudden we were going to be worrying every single day about what was happening on the order of magnitude of 10, 20, 30, 40, 150%. And now all of a sudden we can't do business the same way anymore, because all of a sudden the environment has changed. So I think communication is going to be super important. If you haven't had these types of stand-up meetings with your CSRs to understand, you know, what do tariffs mean for our organization, it's a good time to start thinking about it. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
I was going to say, one of the things that Tariff did for us was to force us into SKU rationalization.
Oh, very interesting. Tell me more about that.
So we kind of make everything and keep everything, and most of our product, 99% of it, is customizable.
Okay.
So when you have somebody who's making something and they order 5 and the minimum make is 10, but you want that deal, so we've had that in the past. So now we've had, 5 product that's sitting there for the past 5 years, 10 years.
Lots of dead inventory.
Lots of dead inventory. So now what we're doing is kind of going through that, seeing if we could maybe fire sale, whatever
Clearance.
sales want to do with that. And then now, depending on what our average sale is for a particular item, all the A, B, or C items, we categorize those along with categorizing our customers from top to bottom tier, and then cutting that off at a certain point.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, the whole idea of SKU rationalization, I think, is a big topic. Other adjustments we see people making to tariffs, what's working for you guys now?
We're trying to figure out, are they putting it in their places to us, or are they doing it as a separate line?
Okay,
We have one vendor that's putting it out as a separate line.
the tariff
It's
amount.
so- Yeah,
Yeah,
it's so new that we don't know which way it's gonna come to us and how to adjust our pricing.
so it's almost like fuel surcharges. It's a
Yeah,
separate line
exactly. That's
item.
what we're
Yeah.
talking about.
We have it coming both ways.
How many
Meaning, what do you said you have,
Price increases and by line.
and by line, okay. So some of them are just unit changes and others have a separate line item.
Yep.
How many are getting separate line item for tariff amounts now?
We know of one so far.
Yeah, but
Okay. How many are you now passing it through to your customers as separate line item? This is an interesting trend. Yeah, I think that's one possibility. And are you finding that the ERP supports that well? No. I think that's where the idea is good, but where the execution makes it hard. Yeah.
So how do you come up with, a separate line item without revealing your cost to the customer?
Well,
If they know what the commodities code is, everybody can solve for errors.
yeah, the question is how do you pass through the tariff amount without revealing your core cost basis?
That's not exactly what we were building.
Yeah, just as
We
a,
expect every customer to go back and backtrack and figure it out.
right.
We just want to be right there till we cover it, that's it.
Other things, what are the biggest challenges? What are the things you wish you could solve now that you are having a hard time solving for? Yeah,
Just accumulate all costs, because if we pay tariff to our freight importer, they charge us separately for the product, so tracing and combining.
being able to attribute it back to the supplier and drive it down to the SKU level.
But then there's the cost of alternate domestic suppliers, which are charging more, may even be raising their prices.
How many of you, that raises an interesting question. How many of you have noticed that your domestic suppliers are raising their prices? That was the unintended consequence. Yeah. But now you have, this is the part that nobody talks about in the politics of it, but basically what you have now is importers raising their prices and opportunistic domestic sellers doing the same thing. They're shadow pricing the importers. So now we're into an even bigger mess, because now it's not just about how much of your line card is subject to foreign sourcing. It's how much of your line card is subject to foreign sourcing or companies that will shadow price them, right? So now you're talking about a much bigger number. So anyway, I just wanted to let you know that Epicor and SPARXiQ have been working hard to be able to master the pricing problem, and that they're important tools in the ERP system to help you deal with all these things. Not everything will be easy for you. Like this whole question of how much do we show and how do we pass it through? Those are strategic decisions that you have to make. But if you want to make sure that you're unlocking all of the functionality, the pricing functionality of the ERP system, talk to your Epicor sales rep about strategic pricing module, or stop by the SPARXiQ booth. We'll be happy to help you guys look at it. Hopefully that was helpful for you. And one more question.
Oh, could you talk a little about how you define sensitive pricing versus non-sensitive
Yeah,
pricing? Is it like per customer, per category?
Great question. So the question is, how do we determine price sensitivity? Price sensitivity can be at each of those levels. There's actually about 3 levels in that case. There's one level, the lowest level of customer sensitivity is an individual customer. That means profiling each customer's market basket, understanding based on multiple factors what will make them price sensitive. Things like repeat ordering, average order quantity, relative spend, the amount of competitive intensity in a particular product category. Those are indicators of high price sensitivity within a customer market basket. Then you move up to the next level, which I would call peer group sensitivity. So let's say commercial contractors or utilities, you've got major customer types. Within those, you could look at the pattern across customers in that grouping. And then you start to aggregate those and come up with group level, customer group level. And then the highest level is what we call universal price sensitivity. And that's where we look across the entire population of customers to arrive at a sensitivity rating. And depending on the problem that we're trying to solve, we might use one or more of those different layers. So if we were doing contract negotiations with a single customer, we'd care about customer level sensitivity. If we were trying to build cost loading factors on our cost basis, we might use the universal one. So depending on the problem we're trying to solve, we need access to each of those three.
Would the customer be more, customer, group of customers be more sensitive to the products they buy frequently and a large volume, or the ones that they buy infrequently? Because I could go both and both.
The question is, do customers become more sensitive on things they buy frequently or things they buy infrequently? Generally speaking, the more frequently, there's many things that create customer price sensitivity, but the more frequently customers buy it, the more they have an incentive to search for competitive pricing. Also, it means that there's more likely to be multiple competitors selling that item. The more rarely something is bought, it's likely there are fewer competitors selling it, and I have a lesser incentive as a customer to shop that product. The savings from shopping it tend to be rare and not as big. The exception to that is when, for example, most of us don't buy a car very often, right? But when you have big ticket items, high dollar value items, then the lack of frequency is more than made up by the value of the transaction, which leads people to shop for it.
It also depends on how quick they need it.
Yes, this is a huge issue.
If the price you have in stock is way down, or
That's right. Yeah,
under contract.
the comment was about the time dimension. Yeah, time is always, and you know, we own, at SPARXiQ, we own a contractor purchasing platform called Material Management Software. It's kind of like Kojo or Remarkable, if you've heard of any of those systems. What happens on these systems is we get to see how do buyers, what's the time expectation of buyers they buy on our platform, and we get to see what is their time requirement. In the construction industry, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, over half of the spend on the platform is needed in less than 48 hours. That's because contractors can't plan their way out of a wet paper bag, right? And yet, what happens when our salespeople at the counter are pricing it? Like half of the revenue's coming in, it's needed in 48 hours, and they still keep hitting the F key and going around it, right? So like they've completely disregarded the time dimension of sensitivity, and it's just foolish. But this happens over and over again. That's why being able to put guardrails on it in the system, that's how you start to solve the problem.
You know, I like the analogy that all price sensitive stuff in grocery stores, the outside aisles,
Mm-hmm.
in everybody's grocery store. The grocery stores make money on everything on the inside aisles.
That's right. So if you go to a gas station, for example, what would you consider to be the core product?
Cigarettes,
Gasoline. What would you consider to be the non-core product? Beef jerky, right? Toothpicks, right? What would happen if the gas station put a 50% margin on gasoline?
we buy beef jerky.
You're buying more beef jerky. You become a beef jerky station, right? That's the whole point, really, is that price sensitivity is really the root of a lot of these problems. And to the degree to which you can start to make sense of price sensitivity, a lot of the other problems in business start to resolve. Other comments or questions? Yeah, in the back.
In general, are you seeing certain categories in our industry become more available and therefore, you know, more sensitive to price, or is the overall supply chain still a big enough problem that the seller has an advantage over the buyer, whether they know it or not?
I think what you're going to see, it's going to be very interesting. That's a very interesting question, first of all. The reason it's interesting is that there are a lot of people who are forward buying to avoid tariffs. And depending on how the tariff situation resolves or doesn't resolve, there could end up being either shortage, right, if they underbought and the tariffs end up creating a massive dislocation, or let's say all of a sudden it gets paused for another 6 months, and then people are sitting on all of that inventory. So I think it's yet to be determined, but what's happening right now, this is why uncertainty is creating winners and losers, right? There's literally going to be industry positions exchanged based on how people react to uncertainty. People who take positions in forward buying are going to have one position. They could either be a winner or loser. People who don't could be winners or losers. It's unknown. But I think in general, you're going to see a lot of categories that are prone to either that bubble effect, if they get backed off of, or a scarcity problem. But it's very hard to know right now.
Well, that's also dictated by your cash flow. You got high cash flow, you can take a position.
That's a great point. It does definitely come down in a lot of cases to who has the money to place bets on different sides of the equation. But it's still a tricky one. Even if you have the cash, it's still not clear. Like during COVID, like it became pretty quickly apparent once the economy started to turn the corner after the initial crash that having inventory was a good thing. In this case, it's possible that inventory won't be good to have. It could go in the opposite direction. So it's a little bit riskier this time.
You also exacerbate the problem because those of us that have cash and take positions and then create more demand for spots, probably actually isn't there.
Right. You're just forward selling, basically. Yeah. Other questions or comments about tariffs?
We got a couple things we're doing. We're adjusting our customer quote validity time. We're reducing that to
Excellent.
a shorter time frame, and we're adding language on the quotations just to warn the customer
Subject to
that
tariffs.
might be coming up.
That's a great point. Yeah, it's cutting the validity period for quotes is a super good one. Putting in new language about subject to tariff adjustment. I think that's a good, if you're in a heavy quoting business where there's these types of project environments, that's a good idea.
I think data integrity is important here. You need to know the country of origin, you need to know the proper HTS code, you need to know the percentage of aluminum and steel. All these factors weigh into 6 different types of tariffs that you are all stackable.
Mm-hmm.
And to get that to pass through to your end user, you need to have the proper facts on the table of what the actual tariff is or isn't.
That was a great point. Yeah, he's basically saying you need to have all the background work done that profiles by product, what are the sources of tariffs and what are the amounts, so that you can have that consolidated view of what the impact is.
When you share that with your customers, not giving them any pushback, but we're not getting big fights or like losing business because of increasing because we're doing this faster. We're not making a profit on the material.
Right.
On top of what we're doing, and as long as we communicate that clearly with the customers, we'll be successful.
Have you gotten much pushback from customers? I think that's because right now everybody is viewing it as it's just a cost of doing business. What's going to happen though, that's going to change that is people are going to start cheating. So people, like I mentioned, the domestic suppliers, right? When the domestic suppliers start imitating the price increases of the importers, that's when the trust factor breaks down. And when the trust factor breaks down, then all of these problems start to kind of spiral again. So I think we're still in kind of the trust stage of tariffs, but as we're hearing with domestic suppliers, shadow pricing behind the importers, that could break down pretty quickly.
Your relationship with your suppliers is important too in that negotiation.
Yeah, the relationship with your suppliers, what's that?
Domestic and
That's right, but you're going to see, it's inevitable, there's going to be this herding effect where you get the domestic suppliers. In part, that's just because when there's too much demand domestically against imports, they are actually experiencing that type of scarcity problem. So part of it is opportunistic and part of it's just the rebalancing.
You called that unintended consequences. I mean, maybe that is the right way to describe it, but I don't think it was a surprising consequence.
Surprising consequence.
I mean, the tariffs are inflationary, and since Trump ran on that platform, economists have been talking about how inflationary it would be, and it's inflationary for all of the reasons that we're seeing, because the imports are inflated and the domestic products are being inflated because they can.
Right.
And they still look relatively inexpensive, but everyone's still paying.
Right. I think the biggest question, like right now, if I were to give advice to somebody who wants to take a speculative position, like you talked about having cash. If you want to take a speculative position, the most interesting question right now is when will the effects of what we're talking about reach the breaking point politically? That's the billion-dollar question, because it's really just a political balancing act. Right now, like the impacts are trickling in, and then they're going to start to gush in. When you know it's going to change is when Ford says, we're laying off 5,000 people because our cost of inputs has gone up and we can't pass these through to our customers. And when that happens in Michigan or in Ohio and other states that are politically vulnerable, that's when the glass is going to break. And I think if you look at the Chinese response to tariffs right now, the Chinese are basically saying, you're a democracy, we're just going to wait till it breaks. And there's no reason for us to act quickly. It's a time bomb, and we're just going to wait for it to blow up. And by the way, in China, we're not having any elections, so have at it. I mean, that's the Chinese approach. Other questions or comments? I want to thank you guys for coming today to learn a little bit about tariffs. Make sure you talk to your Epicor reps or stop by the SPARXiQ booth, and we'll be happy to talk to you. Thank you.